All right, so today we are diving into Our Enemy, the State.
Oh, a classic.
It is. It's by Albert Jay Nock, and, I've wanted to do this one for a while.
Yeah,
And you specifically requested we look at this book through the lens of Austrian economics,
absolutely.
which I think is going to be a really interesting take.
Yeah, it's a great combination.
So, I guess just to get started, like the core thesis of this book is that the state is inherently an antisocial institution, and that its main goal is to exploit one class for the benefit of another.
Yeah, and he really contrasts this with the idea of government, right? Government is this sort of neutral arbiter that protects rights and enforces contracts.
Uh-huh.
But the state is something else entirely.
Yeah, it's like this parasitic entity that is constantly trying to grow its power at the expense of individual liberty.
Exactly. And, from an Austrian perspective, this is like music to our ears, right?
Yeah.
We've been saying this for years,
Yeah.
that government intervention distorts markets, creates all sorts of unintended consequences.
Right.
And ultimately harms society's overall well-being.
Yeah, and Nock really hits the nail on the head with his analysis of the American New Deal.
Oh, absolutely.
He sees it as a prime example of this kind of power grab, where the state comes in with all these seemingly benevolent programs, but in reality, it's just a way to increase its control over people's lives.
It's the classic bait and switch.
Right.
They promise you security and prosperity,
Yeah.
but what you end up with is dependency and stagnation.
Yeah, and he even goes so far as to compare the New Deal to a coup d'etat.
Which, might sound a bit dramatic.
It does.
But when you really look at the scope of government intervention during that period,
Yeah.
it's not that far off.
And one of the things I found really interesting was his example of the Johnstown flood.
Oh, yeah.
Back in the late 1800s when that devastating flood hit,
Right.
society mobilized incredibly effectively to help the victims. People took it upon themselves to provide aid, resources, support.
It was a beautiful example of spontaneous order.
Exactly.
People coming together, using their local knowledge to solve problems.
Yeah, but Nock argues that in the modern era, we've become conditioned to rely on the state for everything.
It's like we've outsourced our responsibility, our compassion,
Right.
to this centralized entity.
And what's scary is that this creates this vicious cycle, right?
Absolutely.
The more we rely on the state, the more power it accumulates.
And the less capable we become as individuals and communities.
Yeah, so it's this really dangerous trend that Nock was warning about back in the 1930s.
And it's only gotten worse since then.
Right. So one of the key things that Nock does in this book is he distinguishes between the state and government.
Yes, this is crucial.
And I think it's really important to unpack that because it's fundamental to understanding his whole argument.
Absolutely.
So for Nock, what is government?
Well, he sees government as this limited institution primarily focused on protecting individual rights,
Okay.
enforcing contracts, maintaining a basic framework for peaceful coexistence.
It's like the referee of the game, right?
Exactly, making sure everyone plays by the rules.
Right.
But the state is a whole different animal.
Yeah.
The state wants to control the game rig, the system in its favor.
And he backs this up with all these historical examples, right?
Oh, yeah, he points to the Hyksos in Egypt, the Norman conquest of England, all these cases where states arose through conquest violence and the desire to extract wealth from others.
Yeah, it's not this like romantic vision of the social contract that we're often taught.
Not at all.
So even in early America, which, we tend to romanticize as this bastion of liberty and individual rights,
Right.
Nock points out that there were already signs of the state's encroaching power. He talks about things like mercantilism and land speculation.
Yeah, even back then you had these interventions that were distorting markets and benefiting certain groups at the expense of others.
Right. So even in that seemingly idyllic early American context, the seeds of state intervention were already being sown.
It's like this underlying tendency that's always there lurking beneath the surface.
And that leads us to another really important part of Nock's argument, which is his focus on land.
Oh yes, land is key.
In Chapter 4, he argues that control over land is absolutely essential for the state's existence and power.
And from an Austrian perspective, this makes perfect sense.
Right.
We see land as a fundamental factor of production.
Yeah.
When the state controls land, it can manipulate its availability, its price, its use to benefit itself and its cronies.
And he gives all these examples of land speculation in colonial America.
Right. Even figures like George Washington were involved in this.
It seems like the allure of using land to generate wealth and influence was just too strong to resist.
And this ties into another key Austrian concept, the Cantillon effect,
Okay.
which basically says that newly created money and credit don't flow evenly through the economy.
Right.
They tend to benefit those closest to the source of creation.
So the people who are already well connected,
Exactly.
the insider.
And often those involved in asset markets like land.
So not only does the state control this crucial resource,
Uh-huh.
but it can also manipulate its value through monetary policy.
Yeah, further enriching those connected to the ledgers of power.
It's a system ripe for cronyism and corruption,
Absolutely.
which is something that Nock was deeply concerned about.
And we see this pattern playing out throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever the state gains control over key resources or industries.
Yeah. It creates this uneven playing field where political connections become more valuable than productive effort,
Exactly.
which ultimately undermines genuine economic progress and harms society as a whole.
It's a recipe for stagnation and decline.
So with all this in mind, it makes you look at the American Revolution in a whole new light.
It does.
Was it truly a fight for liberty, or was it also, at least in part, a struggle to control the state's apparatus for economic gain?
That's a question that's worth pondering.
And it's something we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into Nock's analysis.
Stay tuned, folks. It's going to get interesting. Yeah, so, we were just talking about how even in early America, there were already those signs of the state kind of, encroaching.
Right, flexing its muscles a little bit.
Exactly. And this leads us right into the American Revolution, which
Right.
was often portrayed as this purely idealistic fight for freedom, right?
Right, throwing off the shackles of tyranny and all that.
Exactly. But Nock complicates this narrative a bit.
Uh-huh.
He suggests that while the colonists certainly valued liberty, they also had a keen understanding of the state's power,
Okay.
and they weren't afraid to use it to their advantage.
So it wasn't just about lofty ideals like no taxation without representation.
Oh, that was certainly part of it.
Yeah.
But there were also some pretty clear economic motivations at play.
Like what?
Well, Nock points to examples like the British shipping restrictions,
Right.
which would have directly impacted colonial businesses.
Uh-huh. So it's like they wanted to be free to win their own money.
Exactly. They wanted control over their own economic destinies.
And this is where the Austrian perspective comes in, right?
Absolutely.
We see this time and time again.
Yeah.
Political revolutions are rarely just about ideology.
Right. There are almost always economic interests intertwined.
It's about who gets to benefit from the system, who gets to call the shots.
And ultimately, who controls the flow of resources.
Right, the power dynamics.
Exactly.
So this brings us to the creation of the U.S. Constitution,
the big one.
which, is often hailed as this masterpiece of limited government.
Right, the blueprint for a free society.
But Nock being Nock, he has a slightly different take.
Of course he does.
He argues that while the Constitution contained elements intended to constrain the state's power, it also laid the groundwork for its eventual expansion.
So it's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, how is that even possible? It seems like a contradiction.
Well, think of it like this. The Constitution is a document like any other. It's open to interpretation.
Right?
And over time, those interpretations can shift based on the prevailing political and economic winds.
So it's not just about the words on the page.
It's about how those words are understood and applied.
And who's doing the understanding and applying.
Exactly. Who has the power to shape those interpretations?
Nock points to figures like Alexander Hamilton,
Oh, yeah, the OG central banker.
whose financial policies, while maybe brilliant in their own right, also centralized power and expanded the scope of government.
And this is where Austrian insights about the dangers of central banking become really crucial.
Right.
When you give the state the power to create money,
Yeah.
you give it an incredibly powerful tool to manipulate the economy.
And benefit certain groups over others.
It's the ultimate form of cronyism.
Nock saw this happening in his own time with the rise of what he called the merchant state,
Right, this unholy alliance between government and big business.
where powerful business interests use their influence over government to enrich themselves.
At the expense of everyone else.
And this is a pattern that we see again and again throughout history.
It's like a fundamental law of power.
Yeah, the state always finds a way to co-opt and corrupt.
Especially when it comes to money.
So if Nock is right, and the Constitution itself wasn't enough to restrain the state's growth, what hope is there? Is this just an inevitable cycle of power consolidation and exploitation?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Nock, despite his pessimism about the state's trajectory,
Yeah.
wasn't a complete fatalist.
So there's a glimmer of hope,
He believed that individuals could still make a difference,
even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds.
even against the Leviathan itself.
So what's the antidote?
Well, one crucial step is understanding the nature of the game.
Right.
Nock was incredibly astute in recognizing how the state uses language propaganda, even seemingly benevolent policies,
Right.
to mask its true intentions.
Like a master of deception.
It's like a madam.
Yeah, sleight of hand.
Exactly. You think you're getting one thing, but you're actually getting something else entirely.
Really talks about these imposter terms.
Oh, yeah.
How words like democracy, social justice, even individualism
Right.
get co-opted and redefined to serve the state's agenda.
It's a form of linguistic manipulation.
Yeah, it's Orwellian.
It's incredibly effective.
Because it allows the state to expand its power while appearing to champion the very values that it's undermining.
It's insidious.
So how do we see through the smoke and mirrors?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
How do we discern what's truly in the public interest versus what's just serving the state's own goals?
Well, that's where critical thinking comes in.
Okay.
We need to be skeptical of grand promises and utopian schemes.
Right.
We need to look beyond the rhetoric and examine the incentives at play.
The cubano.
Exactly. Who benefits from a particular policy?
Who pays the price?
Follow the money!
Nock was particularly scathing in his critique of the American party system.
Oh yeah, he did not hold back.
Which he saw as a charade.
A circus.
Designed to create the illusion of choice.
While maintaining the status quo.
And from an Austrian perspective, his critique rings true.
Absolutely.
We see political parties as coalitions,
vying for control of the state's apparatus.
often with little regard for principles or the common good.
It's all about power.
It's a game.
A very cynical game.
So if we can't rely on the political process to rein in the state, what are we left with? Is it all just hopeless?
Not necessarily. Remember, Nock believed that even small acts of resistance can make a difference.
Okay.
He talked about the importance of the remnant.
The remnant.
Those individuals who refuse to be co-opted by the system,
Right.
who think for themselves, who live by principle.
They're like the rebels, the dissidents.
Exactly. The ones who keep the flame of liberty burning.
He saw them as the seeds of a future society.
A society based on voluntary cooperation, individual liberty, a genuine respect for human dignity.
So it's not about trying to change the system from within.
Not necessarily.
It's more about creating alternative spaces where those values can flourish.
Exactly. Building parallel structures, fostering communities of like-minded individuals, demonstrating the viability of alternatives to the state's centralized control.
And from an Austrian perspective, this makes a lot of sense.
It does.
We see the power of spontaneous order.
Of individuals coming together freely to solve problems.
Right.
Create value without the need for top-down direction.
It's like the market, but for everything.
Exactly.
So what are some concrete examples of what this might look like in practice?
Well, for starters, there's the whole realm of entrepreneurship and innovation.
Okay.
When individuals are free to create, to experiment, to trade with one another, they generate wealth and solve problems in ways that the state could never anticipate or replicate.
It's like the invisible hand at work.
Exactly.
It's about fostering a culture of self-reliance.
Of taking responsibility for our own lives and communities.
Rather than relying on the state to provide for us.
Which ultimately creates dependency and weakens us.
And it's about building alternative institutions.
Like what?
Whether it's private schools, mutual aid societies, decentralized forms of currency and finance.
The crypto folks would love that.
It's about creating spaces where individuals can exercise their freedom,
pursue their own goals,
and build a better future without the interference of the state.
It's a beautiful vision.
Now, I know this might sound idealistic, even utopian to some.
It does.
But Nock believed that these small acts of resistance, these efforts to build something better outside the system, were essential for preserving the flame of liberty.
And for laying the groundwork for a truly free society.
It's a long-term project.
A generational challenge.
But it starts with individuals waking up to the state's true nature.
And embracing the principles of a free society.
And this is where Nock's insights, combined with the Austrian perspective, become so powerful.
They do.
They offer a framework for understanding the state's behavior.
For recognizing its limitations.
And for charting a path towards a more free and prosperous future.
It's not an easy path.
But it's a necessary one.
If we want to preserve the values of individual liberty and economic freedom.
For ourselves and for future generations.
So where does this leave you, our listener?
What resonates with you from Nock's analysis?
What insights have you gleaned from this deep dive?
Through an Austrian lens.
Yeah, so, we've been talking about Nock's ideas about the state.
Right.
And it can all seem a bit doom and gloom, can't it?
It can be. Yeah, I mean, he doesn't sugarcoat things.
No, he doesn't.
He's pretty clear about the dangers of unchecked state power.
Yeah, and its tendency to expand its reach into every aspect of our lives.
Right, and we've talked about the problems with central banking, the manipulation of language, the limits of political solutions.
Yeah, it can all feel a bit overwhelming.
So where do we go from here?
That's the big question, right?
If we accept Nock's premise that the state is inherently this exploitative force, how do we resist its encroachment on our freedom?
Well, Nock himself was pretty skeptical about the prospects for large-scale political reform.
Right, he saw the state as kind of a master manipulator.
Exactly, adept at co-opting any attempts to limit its power.
He talks about how the state uses these impastor terms
Oh, yeah.
to disguise its true agenda.
Right. Words like democracy, progress, even individualism get twisted and distorted to serve the state's own interests.
So it's like a propaganda machine.
It's incredibly effective.
Because it makes people think they're supporting something good.
Right, when in reality, they're just strengthening the state's grip on power.
So if political solutions are kind of off the table, what are we left with?
Well, Nock does offer a glimmer of hope.
Okay.
But it's a subtle kind of hope.
Okay.
It's rooted in the power of individual action.
Okay.
And the potential for building alternatives to the dominant system.
So it's about creating something new.
In a way, yes.
Rather than trying to fix the old.
Exactly.
He talks about the remnant.
Right.
These individuals who see through the state's illusions.
Mm-hmm.
And who are committed to living by principle.
Even when it's hard. Even when it's unpopular.
They're like the pioneers, the trailblazers.
Yeah, they're the ones who keep the flame of liberty alive.
He saw them as the seeds of a future society.
A society based on voluntary cooperation, mutual respect. And a deep distrust of centralized power.
So it's not about fighting the state head-on.
Not necessarily.
It's more about building something better alongside it.
Right, creating alternative spaces where freedom can flourish.
And this resonates a lot with Austrian economics.
It does.
This idea of spontaneous order.
Of individuals coming together to solve problems without the need for top-down control.
It's like the market, but for everything.
Exactly.
So what would this look like in practice?
Well, there are a lot of possibilities.
Like what?
For starters, there's entrepreneurship.
Okay.
Creating new businesses, new technologies, new ways of doing things that challenge the status quo and provide people with more choices.
It's about empowering individuals to take control of their own lives.
Exactly.
And to create value for themselves and others.
And then there's the whole realm of alternative institutions.
Like what?
Private schools, homeschooling co-ops, mutual aid societies.
Right.
Even alternative currencies and financial systems.
So it's about building these parallel structures.
Yeah, that operate outside the control of the state.
And that allow people to live more freely and independently.
Exactly.
It's a pretty radical vision.
It is.
But, you know, Nock believed that these small acts of defiance, these efforts to create something new,
right,
were crucial for the long-term survival of liberty.
It's about planting those seeds
Right.
that can eventually grow into a more free and prosperous society.
And I think that's a message that's more relevant than ever today.
It is.
We're seeing this massive expansion of state power all around the world.
Yeah,
And it can feel pretty overwhelming.
it can.
But Nock reminds us that even small acts of resistance can make a difference.
They can.
That it's up to each of us to choose freedom.
To build those alternatives.
Create a better future for ourselves and for generations to come.
It's a long game.
It is.
But it's a game worth playing.
And I think that's a great place to leave it.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into our enemy, the state.
It's been a fascinating exploration.
Through an Austrian lens.
And we hope you'll join us again next time for another deep dive into the world of ideas.
Until then, stay curious, stay free.